Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. It's time for another episode. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. This episode is brought to you by Wondrium. The former Great Courses teaching company is now a broader subscription-based system that you get on your phone or your laptop or however you prefer to consume your online content that's streamed, and you can do it through Wondrium, which is a series of college-level audio and video courses. I just take the audio because I do it while I'm doing something else, but it's great either way. The videos, I have done a few of those actually when it's pretty visual and you need to see what's going on. Anyway, it's a whole series of long form courses that I've taken dozens and dozens of that I talk about a lot, but it's also short form videos and tutorials and how-to lessons, travel logs, documentaries, films, and just all kinds of great content like that. Check it out. If you do so through me, through the show here, by going to wondrium.com/Shermer, you get 50% off the first 3 months. That's half off the first quarter of the subscription. Wondrium, WONDRIUM.com/Shermer. You know the name, SHERMER, Wondrium.com/Shermer. Half off that first subscription, first quarter of the subscription. Here's an episode, or here's a series that I'm interested in taking. 24 30-minute lectures on the scientific guide to health and happiness. That's a worthy goal to have, right? Health and happiness. The health and happiness connection, there is one, obviously. What do we know about living longer? Well, I wrote a book about the attempt to achieve immortality, and I included some of that really great, interesting content and what it means to say that people live twice as long as they used to. It's not like people used to live to the ripe old age of 80 and now they live to 160. No, it's that more of us are making it up into the 80s. That's what that means. Anyway, happy heart, healthy heart. Yeah, that's always good. That's why I ride my bike every day. Better habits for healthy eating. I'm not so good about that. I should probably pick up some of their cues. I eat relatively healthy, but then, glass of wine or beer, maybe a little ice cream after dinner. Probably not on the schedule here, but, all things in moderation. Okay, I'm riffing on this. Music, happy stimulation for the mind. Yes, I do mix up content like this with music when I'm driving. And so, anyway, check it out, wondrium.com/Shermer, wondrium.com/SHERMER. Get 50% off, half off the first quarter of your subscription. So check it out. Thanks for listening, and here's our episode. My guest today is Beth Ann Patrick, who is the ultimate literary insider. If you read book reviews, you undoubtedly know Beth Ann. Her endorsements in venues like the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, NPR, and the Boston Globe have moved hundreds of thousands of copies. Hey, you're my new best friend as an author. Check your shelves. Chances are you own a book or three with a Beth Ann blurb on the cover. An influencer in the book world, Beth Ann, at TheBookMaven is her Twitter account, has 200,000 Twitter followers. Actually, I just checked. It's 209,000. You're slightly ahead of me. Well done. And originated the popular Friday Reads tag. That is hashtag Friday Reads. The author of 2 books for National Geographic and editor of an anthology for Regan Arts. Patrick's debut memoir, Life B, will be published by Counterpoint in May of 2023. Beth Ann, thanks for coming on. What is Life B and what was Life A?
Thank you so much, Michael. I'm really happy to be here. And Life B is about overcoming double depression, which is a mental illness that I have suffered from my entire life. And I was about 5 or 6 years ago properly diagnosed and given proper treatment. And so Life A was a life in which I thought I was getting better and I was trying to get better, but I couldn't because I didn't know what was actually wrong. And now I'm living a much better, much different life. And so, depression memoirs are a dime a dozen. I don't expect all of your listeners will be interested in it, but it was a really important book for me to write, and I'm very proud of it.
Yeah, interesting, because there was just that meta-analysis published in a major medical journal on basically 50 years of SSRIs as treatment for depression, showing, basically no effect at all, or, not beyond randomness or talking to, a therapist or a friend or whatever, which was a little discouraging because I thought we'd, kind of gotten a handle on the right brain chemistry to treat depression. Apparently it's more complicated than that.
It is complicated, and I don't want to, I know we want to talk about other things today,
But it's
but
okay. No, we can talk about anything we want.
I do take an SSRI, and but I also need an anticyclic along with the SSRI to keep me, double depression is a disease that many people cannot be diagnosed properly with until a doctor knows that they have a first-degree family member who has been diagnosed with bipolar syndrome. And that's when they realize and understand that the person is also cycling. But I never experienced mania. In fact, people with double depression, and I do know other people who have been diagnosed with it and are successfully treated for it. People with double depression start out, if this is normal, we start out lower than normal and we dive much worse than normal. So it's a very difficult disease to identify, and you have to be a very compliant and willing patient in order to get better. You have to be willing to go through a lot of family history to look at what your genetic components are, especially when it comes to mental illness. There's a lot in my family. And then you have to be willing to say, okay, I might have to be on these medications for the rest of my life. And I'm willing to do that to be stable and healthy. There are a lot of people in the world who have different forms of mental illness who are very high functioning, but healthy is different from high functioning. And I wanted to be healthy. And that's what Life B is for me. It's one that's healthy and stable and doesn't involve any kind of, why am I feeling this way? Why can't I do X or Y? Now I know I can pretty much handle anything.
Interesting. Yes, I should note that when I mentioned that meta-analysis, of course, these are just on average, looking at statistical effects, which are hard to tease apart. That's not to say that you personally didn't benefit from X, whatever it is, an SSRI or a dietary change or more sleep or exercise or whatever. That's I'm fond of making the distinction between when you say, does something work? Like, does meditation work? Like, I've had this discussion with my friend Deepak Chopra. And it's so if you say, well, meditation works for me, and I say, well, it doesn't work for me, that's one thing. That's kind of a subjective kind of truth. What we want to know in science is, does it really work? Not just for me or you, but for, like 67% of the people who tried 1 hour a day of meditation 6 days a week had, a 60% improvement in their whatever their operational definition is of improvement, stress levels or migraines or depression or whatever it is. So, so I, whatever it is that gets you through the day is, I'm in favor of it. And that includes...
and it's interesting. It's interesting that you mentioned meditation, Michael, because let me just say something. I have discovered that part of the component that probably led to my feelings of depression, my low mood feelings as a child, was I have very significant ADHD. And it wasn't something that when I was a little girl, they were diagnosing female children with. It was mostly looked at in boys, he's just such a handful. He's so hyperactive. And they didn't really understand how it manifests in a woman or a girl. And so meditation for me is something that really works beautifully for my ADHD problems. Now, does that mean it's going to work for Michael Shermer at all? Probably, who knows? Maybe not. But here's what I compare it to. For years, suffering from depression and not being properly diagnosed, I had a really hard time with exercise. People would say, you just need to go for a walk. A walk will, cheer you right up. Walking is very important. And I do walk and I love walking. For me, walking does not lift my spirits. If I am in a low mood, I can go for any kind of walk, 10 minutes, 2 hours, and I'm still going to be low. But no one seemed to believe me when I would say that. It didn't matter whether it was a doctor, my mother, a friend. Everyone thought, oh, you just need more of a walk. You need to get, the pulses racing. It just doesn't work that way for me. And so my point in all of this is that we all have to figure out what works for us. And that takes time. It takes patience. It takes good support. I am really privileged. I have great health insurance. I have a family and a spouse and friends and really good healthcare providers. Not everyone has that, and I understand. And so I am determined in writing this book to end some of the stigma. But actually, it also has to do with the podcast that I'm currently hosting, Missing Pages. And the reason it has to do with that, Michael, is because the podcast is about the publishing industry and about scandals and fiascos and all kinds of things. Some of it's very dishy, some of it's downright, wrong or right, bad stuff. But what we wanted to do was get to what's behind some of this behavior. And in some cases, we cannot diagnose anyone. That is not my role. I am not a medical professional. I am not trying to say someone is this or that. But we thought sometimes we can look and see, does this person who, defrauded someone have trauma in their past? Do they have troubles? Do they have a mental illness? And I think that is a new way of looking sometimes at difficult situations. That's a new perspective. And it's not just mine. It's not just this show's, but that's part of the reason why I wanted to do it. I wanted to be able to knock down artificial hurdles to talking about these issues.
Interesting. Yeah, we're going to get into the whole book industry in just a second, but I wanted to just poke at this a little bit more because it's such an interesting issue with that your physician or psychiatrist wants to know your family history. That does suggest a medical model for depression. Those of us that don't have this as an issue in our lives, I'm one of them. I'm one of those guys that would just say, oh, just go work out every day and change your diet and get some more sleep. You'll be fine. And, that's just not the case. I've met people. I had a girlfriend once who just said, it just doesn't work. I can't even get out of bed without taking the meds. It's like, okay. So I don't know what I'm talking about. And, of course, and also a lot of us, I think, think, well, what's the environmental issue? What happened? Is it something in your childhood? Did somebody insult you last week? Why are you depressed? What did you break up with your spouse? What's going on? But and I think also if I feel down, I don't think I have brain chemistry issues or whatever because I can't even detect any of those. Like I like to say, that schizophrenics, when they hear voices, they hear the voices out there because they can't detect their brain operating. Oh, that's my brain chemistry. You don't sense that, right? So for somebody who suffers depression, is there a propensity, both in the history of treating it and also just somebody who experiences it, to look for external reasons? Why am I feeling this way? Did something happen last week or yesterday? Versus, well, maybe it's just some brain chemistry thing.
It's such an interesting question. And actually, at the National Book Festival this weekend, I'm going to be moderating a conversation between two authors who have written recent books about this exact topic. And it is very interesting to me because when you decide this is not external, that was a turning point for me. So I'm really glad you brought this up. I had always thought that it was external. And the internal part I thought was that I was weak, that I didn't have a strong enough character, that I didn't have enough mettle. My husband, who is a retired Army officer, was a West Point cadet. And his father was as well. And so he grew up in this military environment. And his greatest hero when he was younger was Marcus Aurelius. Stoicism was something that I really related to, even though it wasn't how my temperament worked in the world. I thought, well, this is what you're supposed to be like. Stiff upper lip, ramrod straight spine. This is the military way. I didn't realize that these outer ways of being didn't have to be the only way of being. I also didn't realize that what I thought were external stressors on me were interacting with my actual brain chemistry. And so what happened, Michael, is that when about, I guess, 2015, so about 7 years ago now, I had a really incredible Christmas with my family. Just lovely. One of those holidays where everything goes smoothly. The food gets cooked, people are happy, they get the gifts they love, blah, blah, blah. And I, after that holiday, sunk into one of the worst depressions I'd had in years. And we're not talking that kind of blues that come after like a really great event. Everyone knows you come back from vacation, you're a little, cranky, maybe a little sad. No, this was, deep, deep depression, suicidal ideation. And that's when I went to my doctor and said, I've been seeing a psychiatrist, but something is very wrong. And I know something's very wrong because there is nothing wrong in my life. I have a wonderful spouse. I have adult children who are, out and living their lovely lives. I have colleagues that I appreciate. I have work that I love. Nothing is wrong. What is going on? And that's what led me to find out about this deeply genetic component of my particular illness. So, it's true. It was all inside. Outside, everything was great, but inside there was still stuff that needed to be, neurons that needed to be connected, something like that.
Interesting. Yes. Do you have an opinion on this recent spike in depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, cutting, and so on amongst teenage girls, especially? It's gone up maybe twofold for boys and like sixfold for girls. Maybe it's threefold and sixfold, whatever. It's a lot. Mm-hmm. And, so there's this kind of ongoing debate among psychologists about the cause, from the maybe social media, fear of being left out and FOMO, fear of missing out, FOMO, and fear of being left out, FOBLO, right? And the spike seems to be like 13 to 17-year-olds and so on. Where I teach at Chapman, I have first-year students. We met last night for the first time, and I kind of warned them about this. There's been a big spike at Chapman in the number of students that go to the counseling center. This is their first time away from home ever, so there's a natural kind of background rate of homesickness and that sort of thing. But the last 5 or 7 years or so, there's been a big spike. And so it's not clear what the problem is. Is it too much screen time? Is it the wrong kind of screen time? Get off Facebook, but do Instagram or whatever. Or is it something else, like Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff and the Coddling of the American Mind? They don't think it's screen time so much as they were raised by parents my age, who came of age themselves during the kind of crime wave and the kidnapping with the kid on the milk carton, and all the overprotective playgrounds, and never ever letting your kid play by themselves or walk to the playground by themselves, whatever. So anyway, their thesis is that maybe the kids today are a little more fragile, and therefore this is one of these debates. We don't know the answer to it yet. It's just like there's a couple different theories about it. What do you think?
That is such an interesting thing to think about. And having raised 2 daughters, I definitely have seen things with their friends. And I was paying a lot of attention to what was going on with them, maybe not always as well as I should have, but because I didn't want them to fall into depression. And so I was trying to think about these things. Again, don't know if I succeeded. So to answer your question, first of all, I think anyone who has ever raised a child understands that peer groups are incredibly important to our kids. They get to a certain point, the age can differ and vary and all of that sort of thing. I tend to say to my friends who now have teenagers, you kind of lose them between 13 and 17. And then when they're about 17, they come back and there they are. Doesn't mean that they're perfect or that you're perfect, but they connect with you again. Between 13 and 17, the peer group reigns. And so the thing about peer groups of any kind is that they have a certain kind of groupthink. And believe me, having observed West Point cadets too during the time my husband and I dated in college, as well as being in an all women's college and seeing, that kind of groupthink, which is different, I know that this exists. So when you see adolescents who engage in certain kinds of behavior, you have to look to what their friends are doing, what their friends are obsessed with, what kinds of behaviors they're mimicking. Now, I would never want to say that a child in distress, a child who is cutting, a child who is controlling or not controlling her eating, a child who is doing something really destructive to themselves or to others, that isn't just something about, the peer group and maybe don't play with this person or that person. That's really serious. But I do think that kids who don't talk to their parents aren't able to say, so-and-so is doing this. What do you think about it? And that's where I personally think the problems multiply. It's when you have a whole bunch of kids who either hang out together or know each other and hear about something, and they keep trying it. And none of the kids ever goes to mom or dad, or mom and dad and say, is this okay? So-and-so says it's okay, but I'm uncomfortable. You have to be able to go to a parent and say, this makes me uncomfortable, or I did this, can I come to you and get some counsel, some comfort? It's really about, and I'm not saying that the parental relationship is all, but boy, if that door is open, one of the things we did for both girls, and they took advantage of it, was to say, you need a ride home. No questions will be asked. We don't care, what you've done, what you're on, who you've been with. We want you home safely. You can call us. And they did. And I'm so far from the perfect parent, Michael. I shouldn't, be advising, but I just think it's so important to keep the lines of communication open with the adults in our children's lives.
Yeah, well, that's good advice. I have 2 kids myself, so I concur. All right, here's a perfect transition to the book world. Here is this last Sunday's New York Times bestseller list, combined print and ebook nonfiction, which is the list I check every week because I write nonfiction books. Number
because
one.
You write nonfiction?
Number 1 book in the New York Times bestseller list, I'm Glad My Mom Died. Jeanette McCurdy, the actress and filmmaker, describes her eating disorders and difficult relationships with her mother. Holy crap. I'm glad her mom wasn't around to see that.
That is the perfect transition. That book I've heard great things about. I haven't read it yet, but I've heard really, really good things about it. And I think Jeanette McCurdy has some reasons to title her book that way and to talk about her mother. And but I know that anytime you write about your family, as I am in this memoir, it's tough. It's really tough. There are going to be members of my family who are not going to be thrilled. But I tried to really keep it about me. For instance, in this memoir, it's like I don't get to tell other people's stories. I get to tell the part of the story that's about me, and sometimes that involves other people. But they say when a writer comes into a family, the family is finished. That's an old saw, but
yeah. But just again, my point here is that there's a market for this. That is, if it's number 1 best-selling book, people must want to read that. And that's not the only one. I mean, there's The Body Keeps the Score, How Trauma Affects the Body. Well, that's not a memoir. Okay, let's see. But there are some other. Here's Crying in H. Mart by Michelle Zahner, the daughter of a Korean mother and Jewish-American father, and the leader of the indie rock project Japanese Breakfast, describes creating her own identity after losing her mother to cancer. right? And then there's, let's see, Educated by Tara Westover, which is a fantastic book of being raised by these loony survivalists in the middle of nowhere and getting herself educated. Finding Me by Viola Davis, the multiple award-winning actress, describes the difficulty she encountered before claiming her sense of self. And of course, Matthew McConaughey's, memoir has been on the list for, I don't know, what, a year. It's astonishing. So obviously people want to read this. Why? Is it because they can kind of empathize or maybe put their own life in context? Well, at least it's not bad as this guy.
Isn't that true? I mean, it is really, really true. It is such a trend that has kept going, the trend toward memoir and the trend toward telling stories in nonfiction forms. And of course, we've just recently had this new thing about J.K. Rowling, I guess, trying her hand at autofiction or something. And I think everybody wants to have their voice heard. And I'm not sure why they think that fiction isn't a place to have your voice heard, because I review mostly fiction, mostly literary fiction, sometimes mysteries and thrillers as well. And I find so much power and voice and authority in the characters that novelists create. For me, that's a place where truth can be told and heard in a different way. So I'm not sure why everyone wants to write nonfiction. For me, the only way I could tell my story was through nonfiction. So perhaps that is one aspect. Perhaps these fellow memoirists, I'm not going to be on the New York Times bestseller list, but these people who are also writing memoir or also telling their story, that may be part of it. They don't see another way to tell it. They don't have anything but their own unique voice. Another part of it, I think, is that readers long for authenticity, and they don't always understand that authenticity can come through the imagined worlds as well. They think, I don't know, this is, Michael, I could go into a whole different subject, a whole different show. I think part of the problem with modern literature is that we teach boys to love nonfiction. And a lot of men think nonfiction is the only real stuff out there. And I could go down my little, rabbit hole with that. I won't. But I wish that we could give fiction equal time with nonfiction. It's not for everything. Some books, like the ones you write, have to be nonfiction. It's just that it's not the only way. It isn't the only way to get out there. But I don't know, Jeanette McCurdy, Viola Davis, Matthew McConaughey, these are pretty interesting voices. These are Tara Westover, an amazing voice in Educated, So I don't know. Readers aren't done with this kind of book yet. That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, but aren't there, in terms of total sales, doesn't fiction sell far more than nonfiction? Just raw numbers?
It does. It does sell a great deal more, but it's selling it's selling to women. Women are the avid readers and the avid consumers of fiction. Yeah. There's
Is that
no,
right? I don't know much about that. That's interesting. Wonder why that would be, since so much of great literature and history was written by men. Of course, it was the only game in town, and women didn't even have a voice. So fortunately that's changed now. But I wonder why the audience... Thank
you for mentioning that.
Wonder why the audience hasn't shifted. Maybe it's because what you said, right? That it's, boys are, we just have to be interested in nonfiction because that's the real stuff. Right? Well, I also want to mention, who was that guy that wrote A Million Little Pieces about a memoir, and he was on Oprah's show?
Fry.
James Fry, right. And it turns out he made it up. But in a way, he kind of spin doctored that to say, well, it's my truth. And so kind of fictional memoir would be like that, right? Of course, you have to be honest about it up front, I suppose. But, but just kind of channeling through a character in a novel, that is the kind of truth. That's okay.
It absolutely is. I talked about James Fry the other day with another interviewer, and what I said to her is, if he had published A Million Little Pieces as a novel, it would have been fine, totally fine. Why did he feel he had to publish it as a memoir? I think partly because of this largely male predilection for things that are labeled nonfiction. It really happened. I will go down my little rabbit hole now. So I see boys, and I saw these boys, friends of my daughters when they were young, in teaching at different levels. Boys are often pointed, they don't want a story. They don't want something made up. They want to know facts. They want to know about dinosaurs and insects and how a castle is built and all this sort of thing. And guess what? Teachers point them to that because it keeps them interested, right? It holds their attention. I don't blame the teachers for saying, hey, this is a great way to get this student involved and engaged in reading. First of all, I think teachers should give more nonfiction to girl children as well. And of course, we're in a time of incredible gender fluidity. So I don't want to use boys and girls too cheaply or without thought. But let's say, a child who presents as a girl, don't keep that child away from the nonfiction. Don't think that there is one thing for one group of children and just one thing for another group. However, there's a book for every reader. And if, I know my older daughter was not into princess stories or tales about dolls. But when I got her, of course, I can't remember the author's name right now, but there's a tremendous series called My Father's Dragon. It's a little bit older. It's from the 30s. And therefore, I would say older readers, but it was great bedtime reading when she was, let's say, 4, 5, 6 years old. And when I found those stories, she was really happy because it captured her. So find the books that capture, those kids and encourage them to look at all different kinds. Don't just give, when it's library time at school, don't just give the boys over to the nonfiction side and the girls over to the fiction side. I'm not sure where the question went, Michael, at this point.
That's super good. Now, when I was raising my daughter, who's now 30, this is when Harry Potter came online, and she
yes.
Of course read all the books, and I read them aloud, and then she read them. So I mean, total fiction was great. My son, he's now 6. He's quite the little storyteller in his head. He makes up stories, and he'll sit there for
wonderful.
the longest time with his little trucks and cars, and he's got stuff going on, and this one's doing that, and he's talking and making noises and do, and then you go to no. You hear him doing all this little stuff. That's fiction. He's just making stuff up, and sometimes I'll not realize it's what he's doing, and I'll jump in there with a trucker. He's like, Daddy, this is my story time. Oh, sorry. Right. So maybe somewhere at some point when he gets nudged by teachers or whatever to, read the dinosaur books, not the novels, whatever, I should push back against that a little bit. Maybe one transition would be science fiction.
Against that.
Yeah. Maybe science fiction
Absolutely.
would be good, right? Because boys love science fiction, and that's a good channel into fiction in general.
And look what I'm going to say about that. I loved science fiction so much when I was in middle school. The gateway drug for me in middle school was the great golden age writers, Arthur C. Clarke and Ray Bradbury and Peter S. Beagle and Isaac Asimov. And my dad or mom, whomever, brought us to the library on the weekend, I would just... Oh my gosh, I would go to the science fiction shelves. Yes, that is a classic. Absolutely. And it was so much fun for me.
Yeah.
Right. Dune, my father reading Dune, and I couldn't wait to get my hands. He would come back from business trips with, a different volume, and I couldn't wait to get my hands on those. So you never know what's going to spark your child's storytelling imagination. And listen, I think this is an important point, and it's part of Missing Pages too, because podcasts are storytelling, right? And so storytelling is so important in our world now. We need narratives to help us all understand a lot of things, from, violence in our country to the history of racism in our country to climate change. All around the world, people need to understand how a narrative works, not just so that they can write, a fun story or something for entertainment. We need narratives for podcasts. We need narratives for the news. We need narratives, even the driest white paper needs to have a sense of a narrative in it, right? And so I think learning from childhood, what makes a story and making up our own, like your son with his little, love that. I'm ready for grandchildren. So I think that kind of thing cannot be given enough space in a child's life. And we see, I mentioned Missing Pages again, and I'm not trying to harp on it just because, I'm in the middle of launching this podcast and doing all this PR. I'm mentioning it because we are talking about publishing, and book publishing is the industry where we associate narratives and stories with the actual business of something. And that is, I don't know if it's unique, but it's definitely probably one of the strongest bonds that we see. That's what we're doing when we talk about book publishing, is putting out things that people can follow from start to finish.
Yeah, I know a lot of my social scientists who are not terribly happy about the book sales that Malcolm Gladwell commands and the speaking engagements he gets and the fees and so on. And it's like, how come, I'm doing the research. I can tell those same facts that he tells, but Malcolm is a great storyteller. I mean, I'd say great writer, but really what his writing is a great story. He just engages you with some particular person, some teacher that's trying to do something, and then he segs into some research about pedagogy and different styles of teaching and so on. And then he takes that research and spins it into a larger narrative for society. And it's very compelling. It's like, who was the guy that came up with the 10,000 hour rule? Well, that was Malcolm Gladwell. Well, it wasn't Malcolm, actually. It was this other guy. Now I can't even remember the other guy's name.
I know. And here's the thing. Like you said, he is not only a great storyteller, but look what Gladwell is doing now with Pushkin. Podcasts, podcasting, right. It's amazing. And oh my goodness. In fact, a Pushkin podcast about Howard Hughes and his fake memoir inspired Jeff Umbro, my executive producer, to start this show. So, Malcolm Gladwell has so much influence. We can't remember who started the 10,000 hour rule. I called myself the BookMaven because I read The Tipping Point.
Yes.
And he talks about mavens. And I thought, oh, I love this. I'm going to be a maven, because a maven is an expert and a freak at the same time. Someone who is just really engaged with their particular obsession.
Anders Ericsson. There we go. Psych professor at Florida State University. I want to give him this credit where it's due.
Let's give credit to Anders Ericsson.
So a final point on that. I love
that.
I've engaged with Jordan Peterson several times over the last few years as he's risen in prominence. And, he really hammers this stuff about mythology and myths and stories and literature, great literature, as a kind of truth. That most of my scientist friends are going, oh, this is just a bunch of bullshit. But no, I trying to understand what he's up to. Great literature does tell truths about human nature, human relationships.
Yep.
And if you're asking, was there really a brothers Karamazov in the late 19th century Russia? You're missing the point. It's about Russia. It's about the transition it was under. It's about the culture, and human relationships and human nature and violence and aggression and jealousy and love. And, those are deep human truths, whether they come through a research paper or a Malcolm Gladwell book or a Dostoevsky or Tolstoy novel. They're all just different ways of talking about the same thing.
They're all just different ways of talking about human psychology. And I definitely, this isn't a dinner table. We can talk about sex, politics, and money here, but I wouldn't want to get too far into religion ever. It's just that one of the things about religion, and I am not diminishing anyone's faith, is that all religious systems, to a greater or lesser extent, make sense with human psychology. They have a place in the way our brains work. We can't deny that. In fact, I think a lot of people who are very faithful and devout would say, well, that's why, this is so great. Maybe, there are some people who still believe this is truth, but this does lead me to talk about something I think is really in our minds right now, which is what just happened to Salman Rushdie at the Chautauqua in New York State. And so the fatwa was issued so long ago. In fact, it was issued, I remember, it was issued before I was in grad school, and I was in a course where we studied the Satanic Verses. And I remember talking about that. And here we are, so many years have gone by, and yet Salman Rushdie is being attacked for the same reasons that the fatwa is still going on. And so here is someone, you can tell me he is good or bad. You can, but the one thing is, and this is another podcast, Michael, we'll have to talk about this offline sometime, but bad artists and great art. Salman Rushdie, no matter what he's like personally, no matter what he's like professionally, writes beautifully. Midnight's Children, many of his other books are just incredible. I don't think The Satanic Verses is his best book, by the way. It's a pretty good book. It's just not his best. But in any case, no one should be attacked on a stage with a knife for talking about his book or anyone else's book. This is not what we want in our lives, in our societies, anywhere around the world. It's just appalling to me to think about our cultural milieus changing because of violence, because of people who can't be trusted. And to think, a literary festival, book festival, none of them have a lot of money. There are no author festivals that, just have money to spare. So there isn't money for a lot of new security, a lot of new, gatekeeping around these authors to keep everybody safe. So I'm thinking about it a lot. I'm thinking about, what does it mean to really exercise free speech? What does it mean to keep people who want to listen to free speech safe? And what does it mean for people who might trim their sails to fit the prevailing, winds? And certainly a skeptic such as yourself, we want to keep as much free speech and as little censorship as possible in this world, right?
Well, I certainly agree with that, but
here goes the skeptic.
Well, here's an argument somebody else would make. Like, for example, I mentioned Jordan Peterson. So, the editors and many of the staff at Houghton Mifflin objected to them publishing his sequel, The 12 More Rules of Life, and to the point where they almost canceled the contract just because they got so much pushback from their own employees. Why? Because he's not woke, to say the least. I wouldn't say he's a conservative in kind of the Ben Shapiro traditional. I don't think he's a Trumpster at all. I just think he's not liberal in any traditional sense, and he's not woke. And I'm not very woke either, I have to admit. So, but I found that appalling, even though there's much I disagree with about Jordan, but the idea that his book shouldn't be published or the employees should object to that. Because some other examples, there was that case of the woman who wrote a novel about a Mexican woman, but she herself was not Mexican.
Right.
So that was considered to be
American
cultural.
Dirt, yeah.
Yeah, American Dirt, right? Yeah. So there's other. Is that not kind of a form of censorship or cancel culture or whatever you want to call it?
Well, American Dirt, there are a couple of things I think people don't always understand about that. One of the things they don't understand is that the publisher chose to use the author's status as the wife of an immigrant to push the book. Now, the author was writing about immigrants from Mexico, excuse me, and illegal immigrants. The author is married to a man from Ireland. So people in the Latinx community quite rightly were like, these things are not coeval, they're not the same thing. Being married to an Irish immigrant does not mean you understand the Mexican immigrant or the Mexican illegal immigrant experience. The other thing that was really unfortunate was that at the launch luncheon, that's given for media, the cover of American Dirt was black and blue and white and had some flowers and a barbed wire element to it because of the border. And so they made some floral arrangements that used barbed wire as part of the centerpieces for the tables. And quite rightly, many people were like, this is the most tasteless choice you could make, to make a floral arrangement for this, privileged luncheon with barbed wire in it. So there were some ways that the book was promoted that were tone deaf. And then a lot of people who learned about the book, who were writers of Hispanic and Latinx origin, they read it and said, this doesn't really make sense. This doesn't really work with our experience. Now, I have not read American Dirt. At some point, I probably am going to have to. I've been avoiding it. But the reason I've been avoiding it is because of all this controversy. I thought, well, maybe it isn't, very well written. I want to know for myself whether or not it's well written. I know some colleagues who have told me they loved it and thought that the author did a fantastic job. But I also respect the colleagues who say, I am Latinx and I read it and she does not know what she's talking about. So it's a difficult, that's a difficult one.
I see. Yeah, that is. Yeah, that's in that kind of gray area. I suppose if I tried to write a novel about what it's like to be raised by survivalists and claw my way out of that environment to Oxford University and get my PhD, mentioning Tara Westover.
I know.
I really haven't any idea what that world would be like, and it would be hard for me to make up stuff that would kind of give the reader a feel for what it's really like. She surely could. I think that's what you're talking about, right? It really helps.
I think that's what I'm talking about. I think what I'm talking about, Michael, is, it's not, I do not think authors should only write about exactly who they are. I don't think that you should only write about white men. But I do think that if you are going to write about a character, you're writing a novel, let's say, about a character who is not a white man, then you need to get as much education about that character as you can. Maybe you're going to talk to someone who is of the same background as that character. Maybe you're going to have a sensitivity reader read your novel. Maybe you're going to decide you can write a protagonist who's a white male, and then this person from another group can be a more minor character. I think thoughtfulness, consideration, and compassion are what's important. And I think people who are being heard right now is saying, don't you dare write a character of this race or this orientation. That's really what they're asking for. They're asking for consideration, and they're also asking, in terms of consideration, for you to perhaps read books, promote books, bring books into the public eye that are written by people who have lived the life, who have had the experiences. And then maybe after a while, we can move things back. The pendulum swings. And right now, I hate the word woke because it's being used by both sides in, I think, ways that are difficult. I don't want to, I want us to give great consideration to underrepresented voices. And this is something that I talked about recently. I have chosen as a critic to say, I'm not going to read as many books by white men as I once did. I've read a lot of them. I have been I have a master's in English. I've been a critic for 20 years now. I've read a lot of books by white men. That doesn't mean that there aren't. I just reviewed the Anthony Mara this year. Last year I reviewed Cloud Cuckoo Land by why can't I remember his name right now? See, brain fog. But there are lots of wonderful books being written by white men. And there are other critics who will always be there. And sometimes that critic is me. But if I can say, I'm going to look a little bit more closely at books by Asian Americans, at books by Black people from around the world, I'm going to look at books by LGBTQ and trans writers, that's a little bit of a change. And I think that's a kind of thing that each person has to decide for herself too. Am I going
Seems like
to
we've made a lot of progress in the last, say, since I was in college, which was 50 years ago. This week, I started college. It seems like the amount of diversity, more women, people of color, and so on, in the academy, in literature, in the arts, in films, and so on. This has changed dramatically in the last 50 years.
It has. I don't think it's changed enough yet. I think there are still so many white writers being published, and it is not commensurate with the number of people of color who are writers who deserve to be paid attention to. And, I just had a piece in the Los Angeles Times a week or two ago about a wonderful company called Boxwala. And I love Boxwala. It is a husband and wife team from Riverside, California, Irvine, excuse me. And they are curating boxes of books with a real feel for global literature. And they have great stuff in their boxes, everything from the amazing Polish writer Olga Tokarczuk.
Oh, I read that article. That was you. Okay.
You did? Yeah.
That was a good story. Yeah, I get the LA Times. I get the LA Times, New York Times, the Wall Street Journal every day.
I love it. Keep newspapers alive. And so the reason I wrote the article is they've entered a new curation with the amazing novelist Alexander Chee. And so he is curating a series for them of new American fiction. And his definition, I know you read the article and I won't go on about it too long, is fiction by especially first generation immigrants now, and what that tells us about America. And so Brother Alive by Khalid, I'm so sorry, Michael, names are out of my head today. Maybe you can add them.
We can put them in the show notes.
Somewhere. Yeah. Put them in the show notes. And another book called The Town of Babylon that is about, so one is set on Staten Island, one is set on Long Island, but one is with Latinx immigrants and one is with Middle Eastern immigrants and Muslim immigrants. And so these books, Alex says, show us a different aspect of American culture, what's really going on in our country today, rather than another, historical novel about a founding father. I mean, that's just, to me, it's not as interesting. I mean, if someone comes up with an amazing new novel, new voice, new idea about Thomas Jefferson, I'm all for it. But I was more into Jocelyn Nicole Johnson's My Monticello. Sorry, I'm from New York, and it's Monticello in New York. And then
It is? Really?
My Monticello.
Oh,
Yeah.
I did not
Yeah.
know
Isn't that funny?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Okay. So
sorry.
yeah, I like everything you just said. I would like to get to the point where we don't have to, say a publisher have to think, well, we need, say, 13% African American titles because there's 13%
right.
African Americans in America. Because that feels like, I don't know, assessing literature by the amount of melanin in somebody's skin. That just feels too artificial. But on the other hand, if you have a diversity of manuscript submissions, you get 1,000, and you're going to publish 100. Mm-hmm. And if you already have, I don't know, 80 by white males, then okay, maybe we should diversify a little bit amongst the ones that are also just as well written. And so
exactly,
given that you have equal quality, once you whittle it down from 1,000 to 100, let's diversify from there. That seems reasonable.
Well, that's exactly what I'm saying. Let's diversify from, let's not accept so much by any one group. Let's be a little more thoughtful in what we bring forward. I'm on the board of the Penn-Faulkner Foundation here in Washington, D.C., and we give an award for fiction each year. It's only for fiction. It's only for novels. Well, we have another Malamud Award for short stories, but that's a different thing. Anyway, in terms of that award, we have to think. We have judges, and we try to make sure the judges are also a diverse group, but they are going to read and love what they are going to read and love. It's the only peer judge prize for fiction in the United States, the Penn-Faulkner Award. And if they say it's going to someone who's Black, great. If they say it's going to someone who's white, great. That is up to the judges. So they are looking, and this is my point to your question or to your observation, Michael, they're looking for excellence in literature. Now, I will play devil's advocate and push back and say, who decided what is excellent in literature? Who made the rules? Who decided that this is how a novel works, or this is how a short story collection should work? I hate to point fingers back at the patriarchy, but, all signs are, it's kind of like a red pulsing neon sign. Guess what? It's men. Men made up the rules. And that's what we kind of have to push back against. Not so much all men, but just that we have to remember where this stuff came from. And we have to remember that we need to think about it. So I am skeptical about how diverse the publishing industry is.
So, but these publishing houses, Random House, Simon Schuster, and so on, Macmillan, they're for-profit companies, right? So at some point, somebody in the decision process has to think, well, whether we like it or not, is it going to sell? Because we have to make money. We got to pay our bills.
You are just pressing all the buttons today. I have so much to say about this because I just finished a few days live tweeting the Penguin Random House trial downtown at the federal courthouse in DC. So I was doing this for Publishers Weekly magazine, not just for my own amusement.
And
Although
give
I
us
could
a quick
have
rundown what this trial is about.
So this is the Department of Justice saw that Penguin Random House last year they're making a bid to buy Simon & Schuster. And the Department of Justice says this would create a monopsony. Have you ever heard of a monopsony before? Because people, no, a lot of people didn't. A monopoly is when a certain, you can only buy from a certain number of sellers. A monopsony is when you have only a certain number of sellers who will buy product. I think I explained that correctly. I'm not sure.
No, that is
so
right.
in other
you
words,
said it right.
Yeah. And so this is really interesting because we've seen so much consolidation in the publishing world over the past couple of decades. Okay. When I started 20, 25 years ago working in publishing, we had lots and lots of different houses. And then you had the big 8, and then the big 7, and the big 6, and we're now down to the big 5. And so if Penguin Random House buys Simon and Schuster and takes it under their wing, then we're down to the big 4. And there are a lot of imprints under the Penguin Random House banner. And I won't, unless you want me to, explain all of that. But the point is, the Department of Justice says, hey, this isn't enough buyers for authors' books. We need more buyers in this market, not fewer buyers. So it's a delicate balance. And Penguin Random House, of course, says, if we don't buy Simon and Schuster, well, they could get sold off to a private equity firm. And then one of our country's most venerable, honored publishers would just vanish. Penguin Random House says that if they buy Simon & Schuster, if the sale goes through, then they will keep Simon & Schuster as a separate entity. I don't know about that, but I do know that they had closing arguments, and the judge, Florence Pan, who is brilliant, is going to hand down her verdict in October. And so right now, everyone's waiting. It's going to be quite interesting to see what happens. What I will tell you, Michael, is here's what came out of the trial. Publishing has no idea how it makes its money. That's what came out of the trial.
What?
Again and again, we yes. Again and again, we heard from agents and publishers and high-level efficiency experts that they're never really sure what's going to sell. They're never really sure what's going to be a bestseller. And one of the things that they were talking about in the trial is the Department of Justice wanted to restrict the idea of books that sell to top-selling books that make that are given advances of $250,000 and over. And of course, one of the things that was very high profile in this trial is that Stephen King came to testify on behalf of the government, because he says, authors don't need to be given fewer outlets for their work. They need more. But the people on the publishing side, on the defense side, were saying, we can give better advances if we have Simon & Schuster under our umbrella. We'll be able to offer more to authors. Well, then they started talking further, and one person said, well, a book with an advance of $10,000 might be the book that becomes a huge seller and makes millions, whereas a book that we give $500,000 to might not even earn out that $500,000. And the judge tried to delve into this and asked a lot about P&L sheets and asked a lot about, spreadsheets. And the further and further she went into it, the more and more it was just kind of like, we don't know.
Astonishing.
And I've got to tell you, that is not, and I'm not doing this to make fun of publishing, okay? Well, maybe a little. But I'm not doing this to make fun of the individual witnesses or to say that they are incompetent in any way. They're not. We're talking, Madeline McIntosh is the head of PRH US. She's a CEO. She's an incredibly competent person, an incredibly competent chief executive. She's really, really good at her job. But when you combine something that is an art, like writing, with a business like publishing, there is stuff in between the two that is just, it's almost like magic. I kept saying things in my tweets like, when are they going to bring out the wand from, Hogwarts? Because nobody seems to know what actually makes a bestseller. There's just, the only books that are predictable are series books from big names. That's it. That's the only prediction you can make.
I wonder if the problem is that they're so big now. It's like when GM announces, oh my God, we lost $2 billion in the third quarter. We had no idea. How could you not know? Why would you not know that last Thursday? Or, the Tuesday before that, you could see it. And the answer is because there's so many different components to what goes into a quarterly report that it takes, an outside company or a accounting firm or whoever runs all that stuff for a company like GM. It just takes them 3 months to even figure it out. They really don't know how much money they're making or losing. And so maybe it's something like that. So let me see if I could, let me see if I can articulate the problem, like Stephen King as an example. So, Stephen King comes to you as a publisher with his umpteenth novel, and he's going to sell 100,000 copies. You're going to make $1 million, pretty much guaranteed. Right. And I come to you with my very first sci-fi novel, and maybe it's big, probably it won't, so maybe if you're a huge company, you go, well, we got to have our quarterly reports coming, we got our stock market, stock sale, whatever. And that's what we're concerned about as a big company. That's our job, is to make money. We're going with Stephen King every time because, it's a lower risk. Even if the advance is higher, we know he's going to sell, right? So his argument then would be the new authors are going to be left out simply as an economic model choice by the company.
Well, and here's the problem. Because the one thing I heard that was true from every witness for the defense is that they love books. They love books, they love book publishing, and they love authors. And that's the problem. You don't have publishers, especially publishers of, I don't know, I don't want to say quality fiction, quality anything, quality nonfiction, whatever, but publishers who are really serious about books and love all different kinds of books. I have like extremely Catholic taste when I read. I read highbrow, lowbrow, middlebrow, and most people in publishing are like that too. Most people in publishing might have a big, fat, serious book. And then on top of it, they've got like some silly comic book. And on top of that, they've got a wonderful memoir. I mean, we all read stuff all the time. And that's what people in publishing want to publish as well. In book publishing, they know if they just publish Stephen King and James Patterson and, I don't know, Nora Roberts, and there are other names, we could think of right now, Michael, I'm sure, that money would just come in and it would be, easy. But they also want to publish debut authors and poets and people who write really interesting, discerning essays and strange little Westerns that, try to redefine the genre. No one is going to keep publishing going without being able to take those risks. And those risks mean that you can't come up with a really good quarterly report sometimes, that sometimes the profit and loss sheets are going to have very strange columns on them. One of the people was talking about how an editor fills out a profit and loss sheet, and there are certain, there's a program for it. There are different ones, probably, a dozen different ones. This one is called Abacus, for example. So Abacus, you're an editor, you want to buy a book. You've read something really exciting. You open up Abacus, you open up your P&L sheet, and there are different fields that you can input. And then there's some fields you can't input. They belong to marketing or they belong to sales. And then there are also some that you have to make up numbers for. And I thought, oh, what a headache this all is. There's no way to fill it out one time and say this works. And I mean, Michael, I'm sure I am not a business person. I am a literary critic. So I'm not saying this doesn't go for other industries as well, and there aren't problems. I'm just talking about publishing, and I'm talking about the fact that there are surprises in publishing. That, Charles Duhigg, who wrote The Power of Habit, very successful author, took the stand, and he was saying, look, I got a $750,000 advance for The Power of Habit, but that money didn't matter to me. Now, wait a minute, right? You're going to say, what are you talking about, Charles Duhigg? But he was saying that he was more concerned with the sales of the book. He says that's where the real money is for the author. And a lot of people heard him say, my advance didn't matter. And they were thinking, well, if I got that much money, I would love to
Nice
say that
problem
it,
to have.
didn't matter. Right. Nice. But that's not what he was saying. He was saying, what you need to focus on is working with the best editor you can and producing the best book you can, because then it is a book that will continue to sell and that you can continue to be proud of. And that's really what matters in publishing, is making sure as many books as possible that go through your particular imprint, your particular publishing house, that they are good enough to last. I have a friend who was recently saying, oh, this book or that book of mine, didn't sell or didn't earn out. And I said, well, think of all the authors who were completely unknown in their lifetimes. But their books matter so much to us now. I'm not saying that you shouldn't be able to pay your bills and buy groceries. And if you are relying just on being an author to do those things, well, maybe being Stephen King is the best way to go. But the one thing I do know is that the writing is the writing and the publishing is the publishing. And they're not ever going to match up perfectly. And that's what I think the public is seeing from this trial, that it's just not possible to make it all work out. There's not a perfect balance sheet for publishing. Yeah. And, I really want Simon Schuster to stick around. I can't predict if it will or if it won't, if the sale doesn't go through. What I can say is that I will never be able to look at publishing the same way after observing that trial.
Yeah. So for listeners not familiar with how this works, an advance is just an advance on your future royalties of the book. I think of it as a interest-free loan.
Yes.
You actually don't get paid anything until that advance is earned out. And let's say you got a $100,000 advance. It's not $100,000 in sales of your book. It's $100,000 of your percentage of the sales of the book, which is generally pretty small.
Exactly.
So it takes a long time. It takes a lot of sales to get to the 100,000. And let's say it takes you 3 to 5 years.
And you also
to
don't
write
get
your
it all
book.
at once.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's broken up, and so if you need the money, that's tough. I get asked by a lot of people who would love to just be full-time writers. It's like, don't give up your day job, because not many people are Stephen King or Malcolm Gladwell. Almost nobody.
That's right.
Gets it to that level. And I do agree with Duhigg. At this point in my life, I guess I'd rather have a really good editor and a beautifully produced book than the big advance. But I can understand if somebody can't make their mortgage, they can't pay the rent, they got to have that money. But seems like there's another incentive problem here. Let's say it's not Charles Duhigg. Let's say it's somebody else who wants the $750,000 advance. And you, as one of the 5 major publishers, you tell them, well, we're going to put all that money into the highest quality book and promotion and sales because we love you so much. And he's like, well, okay. But then one of the other big 5 goes, hey, we'll give you the $750,000. Well, he's going with the $750,000, right? And so
absolutely.
It seems like the incentives are tilted toward that. If you don't pay it, somebody else will. It's like I was talking to a guy from Intel about why their CEOs of major Fortune 500 companies make so much money. I mean, just hundreds of millions of dollars. The difference between the average worker's salary and American CEOs is, like hundreds of times difference. It's just astonishing. I mean, it's almost obscene, right? But he said, if we don't pay that guy, then somebody else is going to pay him. And he's getting the money one way or the other, and we want him. And we got to hire somebody to be our CEO, and that's going to help us make money. We got to do it. So it seems like it's a structural issue.
Structural issues are exactly it. And by the way, the solution is tax the rich. But I had to get that in.
Okay. Well,
you don't have to say anything more.
Depends what the number is. But everybody's already taxed. What's the number?
But what I will say is structural issues. That's exactly what I'm getting at in this podcast and in talking about publishing, is that we at least need to talk about them. And one of the things about publishing, and I think that's another thing we all learned from this trial, is that it has been very opaque for a very long time. Book publishing has been something no one really knew much about. People don't know, as you were explaining to the audience, people don't know what an advance means. People don't know what agents do or don't do. You could argue either side. People don't understand what it means to earn out on a book. All of these different things. And, we don't have to explain them all right here, but at least in the industry, we need to understand them all. And that's one of the things that has fascinated me. I'm being promoted as this, what did you say at the beginning of my bio? Ultimate insider. But really, I'm more of an outsider. I have worked with people in the New York publishing world, and I have seen it, and I know a lot about it, and I report on it for Publishers Weekly. But I have never worked full time at a New York publishing house. And I think in a way, I'm the ultimate publishing insider because I can look at it with an outsider's eyes, because I can say, this doesn't make sense, or why doesn't everyone know about this? Or, how did so-and-so get to this position without being, looked at more carefully? And so in the podcast, that's one of the things that I'm bringing to bear on the subjects of our episodes is, did they know this before they got in there? Did someone make a cold call? Did someone have connections? Did someone have family? And so on and so forth. And I just believe publishing is not the only industry or the only part of American life that has a certain opacity to it. But I do think it's one where we can get the curtains open and let some light and air in most easily, because
Probably a little bit like
read
here in Southern California, where I live, Los Angeles area. Every other waiter at a restaurant's a screenwriter, right? Hoping, or a would-be actor, hoping that they'll make it. And how do you get in there? I don't know. It's almost a paranormal mystery how that works. Okay. Earlier I cited the New York Times bestseller list. How come I was quoting that to you rather than the Wall Street Journal bestseller list or the Amazon bestseller list? How in the world did that happen? Why is everybody so obsessed with the New York Times bestseller list? My own publisher, I've been on both lists. They don't put that I was on the Wall Street Journal bestseller list. They don't care. It's like, you were on the New York Times. That's the one we're putting on the cover. Okay, how did that happen?
That is the one that affects sales. And let me tell you, the New York Times bestseller list, talk about magic from Hogwarts. I mean, no one knows exactly how that is put together. And the one thing I know, the one thing I factually know about the New York Times bestseller list is that I'm trying to remember if I don't think it was my anthology that I edited. I think it was the book that I wrote for National Geographic, An Uncommon History of Common Courtesy. And maybe it was An Uncommon History of Common Things, because that one was selling really, really crazy numbers. And unfortunately, it was a work for hire. So no money for me there. So I can talk about this. So at the time it came out, I had a friend who was working at an independent bookstore, and the friend contacted me and said, we were given, they get given a checklist that goes to the New York Times for its bestseller list of which books are selling the most in independent bookstores. And she said, your book was one of the ones on the checklist, so it might make it onto the New York Times bestseller list, but I don't know for sure. And I don't think it ever did. And of course, that would have been the nonfiction list and maybe even like one of the sub lists for nonfiction that they have, it's all so magic and hidden, and no one really knows that list that the independent booksellers fill out is just part of it. Then there's the book scan numbers that you can only see if you are a bookseller or an agent. And then there's the sales at the warehouse clubs and the bigger bookstores, some of which still existed when that book came out. So it's all put together in some special kind of way, and no one knows about it except whomever is actually putting together that list. But as you pointed out, Michael, that is considered the gold standard. That is considered the list that makes the difference by, the publishers, by the booksellers, by everyone. I mean, the Washington Post has a bestseller list. The Los Angeles Times has a bestseller list, as you pointed out, Wall Street Journal, etc. But for some reason, the New York Times, partly from the New York Times itself, the Gray Ladies promotion and image, partly from the New York Times Book Review, which has remained the only separate book review in the country until finally this past week, the Washington Post announced that it will bring back its book world, which is really great news for everyone. But yeah, the New York Times Book Review bestseller list is that it is gold. Being on there makes a huge difference. And I wish I could tell you more about how that became so. Maybe that will be something I do a deep dive into.
I wonder if it's something like the Matthew effect, to those who have more shall be given, and those who do not, they'll get even less. You just get a kind of a market head start and no one can catch up. It's like, why can't somebody start something to compete with Twitter? Because everyone's on Twitter.
Because everyone's on Twitter. There's no, yeah. I just saw someone, TikTok and Book Talk have been the big things in publishing for the last year or two, right? Everyone wants to reach the Book Talk crowd. But someone said today, hey, TikTok users, does anyone remember Vine? Do you remember when Vine videos were all the rage? Like, I don't remember how long they were. They were very short. And no one talks about Vine anymore. So a lot of stuff comes and goes. I've been on Twitter now for 14 years, believe it or not. And sometimes in those 14 years, there have been times when I've used it a ton. And there have been times when I've backed away from Twitter, depending on what was going on in my career and what I had to promote. But I have to tell you, the actual connections I've made on Twitter, not just in real life, because I've met a lot of Twitter friends in real life, both personal and professional, but even the people that I've never met who have been supportive and helpful and, helped me with things, helped me promote things or helped me make a network connection. Twitter is real stuff. It's not everyone loves it. I don't blame them. I know there's a lot of dreck on Twitter, but for me, anecdotally, it has been a very good thing.
Yeah, I think so too. I think let's talk about, since we're pushing up here on almost an hour and a half, digital versus print, ebooks, audiobooks. I mean, I'm old school.
Oh my gosh.
I'm
Do you
about
have
to turn
another
68.
hour and a half?
I love physical books. I love physical books. I have them all over my room here, and physical newspapers and so on. But I do listen to audiobooks because it's a great multitasking thing when you're driving. In my case, cycling too, hiking with the dog, vacuuming the house, whatever, just doing chores. I always have an earbud in, and if it's not a podcast or a great courses from the teaching company Wondrium, it's an audiobook. And most of the authors I talk to on the show they all now have audiobooks. Half of them read them themselves, which I really like. But how do you think it's going to shake down in the coming years of like percentage, print, digital, and audio?
I love this question. Someone said to me recently, because of audiobooks, they said, well, podcasts, and we talked about this a little earlier, are also stories. What about a collection of podcast episodes? Would that be considered a book? In the same way. And I said, listen, I don't know, but I will never say never. And here's why. Audiobooks, my husband consumes them almost exclusively. I still read on paper. I also read in print online, on an e-reading app. He loves audiobooks. Guess what? They reach the same part of your brain. It doesn't matter. Just do what you love and consume the way you want to consume, because it does count as reading. Audiobooks are not fake reading. They're real reading. I will say, for me, no one could read an audiobook as quickly as I am able at this point in my life and career to read a book, a printed page. One of the things, and I think this probably comes from anyone who has been to any kind of grad school, learns how to consume printed material at a very, very fast rate. So I'll blame that on grad school. But I think audiobooks are amazing because of the asynchronous nature. Like you said, you don't have to sit in a chair with an audiobook. You can vacuum. You can listen to an audiobook while you're, driving a long commute. There's so many things you can do while you're listening to an audiobook. And with the different speeds, you can listen at the speed that's most comfortable for you. So I think they're amazing. I also think any kind of digital book is amazing, and always have, because I think we get a little precious about our paper books. Like you can see, I have tons back here. I have just, everything. I love them.
Yeah.
But guess what? In the world, not everyone has space for bookshelves. Not everyone has money for paper books. Not everyone has access to these books. People in parts of the world that don't have access to great bookstores, to shipping, to curation of books that might be interesting for them, desperately need digital books and audiobooks and other ways of consuming what amounts to ideas. This is one of the things, Michael, that I will say about why I remain passionate about book publishing. Books aren't just products. No book is, maybe there's a couple of pieces of garbage out there that should never have been published that, I don't give a lot of respect to. But on the whole, books are not just things to be put on a shelf and sold. They are the repositories of our ideas, our arguments, our dreams, our information, all of these things that are part of what makes us human. And so I'm all for these new forms. I don't think they are going to ruin publishing. They haven't done it yet. It's just different ways of being able to access that very important content. And I please, no one mishear me. I am not using content in that sort of trendy way of it's all content. I really mean, deep, important, things that are the bedrock of all civilizations. How else would we know about all of the creation stories that come to us from all around the world unless we had them in some kind of printed or now audio form? I'm getting, it's that point in the afternoon where you become inarticulate.
No, you're articulating quite well. In fact, I think that
Thank you.
that idea of content production, there are these kind of doomsayers say, well, long form reading is going to disappear because of Twitter and blogs and, TikTok and, nothing longer than 15 seconds, please. My attention span just isn't long enough. I don't think that's true. Do you? I think maybe you can have both. You can enjoy that and sit down and read a 1,000-page novel.
It's a very difficult thing, because I'm sure I am going to say there are probably statistics saying that we have fewer people reading this or that. Of course, we all know you can lie with statistics, right? I have these 20-something children who are readers. They're not readers the level that I am, but they love reading. They find reading a great thing for entertainment and information. They both are, always asking for recommendations. And like I said, I've got the audiobook listening spouse who is walking the dog and, listening to novels that he never would have read before because he was always reading nonfiction. He thought that looked more, manly or something. And I'm teasing you. I'm teasing you, dear, if you're listening. But I think we are just finding new ways to consume long form ideas, stories, and arguments. And I think we will find those. Maybe someone doesn't want to read, a big, thick, dry book about, I don't know, the kings and queens of X country. But maybe if it's put into a great, lively audiobook form and is shaped or formatted in a new way, it's going to appeal to them. I just don't believe that we can't pay attention anymore. I think we need to find what it is people are paying attention to and find ways to make sure that they also pay attention to things that are really important and not just, the latest sneaker or hair trend or things like that. I mean, those are fun and important. Believe me, I like to have a good pair of sneakers myself, but we also need to remind people that if you want to solve problems in this world, which we all are concerned about now, we need to think about them in a way that's beyond a paragraph.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Okay, Beth Ann, we're coming up on exactly an hour and a half, which is my normal time. But I have two last questions. The future of bookstores. Why should I buy a book at the local Chaucer's bookstore here in Santa Barbara when I can get it on Amazon for 40% cheaper and they'll deliver it to my door in 2 days? What's the future of
first of
bookstores?
All, shout out to Chaucer's bookstore in Santa Barbara. We love independent bookstores. And I have great ones here in DC. And I'm glad to say we've had new ones in the past decade. We've gotten quite a few new ones, which is
nice.
Really heartening to me. And so I think, first of all, think of the children, Michael. Think of your little guy. Talk about a gateway drug. Going into a bookstore as a child is the thing that is going to excite you the most about books. One of the things they say about kids and books is that it doesn't matter so much if your parents are big readers as if they have books in the house. Isn't that interesting? And it's because I think, this is totally unscientific. I think knowing that you can live with books and that books can be taken off a shelf and put back on a shelf and enjoyed over and over again, that's an idea that really makes a lifelong reader. And so bookstores, I think, are one of those places, especially for kids whose parents don't, like us, have books and newspapers and magazines, all around the house. This is, libraries also are part of this, but bookstores are where you can go and get a book that belongs to you. And so I want to give another shout out to all those great organizations like First Book and Reading is Fundamental, who help kids get books that belong to them. That really matters. So there's one big reason for indie bookstores. Another big reason for indie bookstores is discoverability. On Amazon, you get on this, yes, you're going to get the book for cheap, but do you know if the book's any good? I don't know. Booksellers are fonts of information. They're fantastic. The best booksellers that I know, and there are a lot of them, can really say, do not pick that one up. You will hate it. I know that you bought this kind of book last time. Try this instead. They can really help you discover the best books for you. They're fun. They're visually enthralling. They make a community, a place that has a store that isn't just about consumption. So I could go on, but I know you have another question.
No, I agree, because I love walking around bookstores. Powell's bookstore in Portland was always my favorite place to go for book signings, and I could spend all day there. And it's nice that they add, that bookstores are adding a little cafe to get your coffee and your latte and places to sit with your laptop and
Yes.
internet access. And I have no idea if that actually pays, where people spending more time there spend more money, or if it's a waste of their space. I don't know how they calculate that, but I like it. Okay, so last question. This comes, so I'll repeat one of my favorite quotes from the late, great Christopher Hitchens, who always had a snarky remark at hand, one of which was, everyone has a book in them.
Yes, he did.
Everyone has a book in them, and in most cases, that's where it should stay. That's pretty nasty. But
Hitchens.
People do feel like that. So, yeah. So when someone comes to you and says, I really want to write a book, I want to do what you're doing, and how do I get an agent? How do I do a book? Where would you steer them? How should you answer them?
Yes, it should. The book should stay inside you. There are different levels of this depending on how much of a glommer the person is. And believe me, there are some people who just want you. It's any profession, right? If you're a doctor, you're a lawyer, you're a journalist, there are going to be people who come to you and want everything for free. And all of us, sort of learn along the way to discern, is this a person who really is well-meaning? Is this a person with an actual question just to be answered? If you go up to a doctor and say, listen, I don't want to bother you, but I'm having trouble finding a good provider in this area. Where would you steer me? The doctor is going to be like, okay, I can be helpful. But if you go up to a doctor and stick your hand in her face and say, what is this? That's no good. So usually what I tell people is, do the writing. I know you have this great idea and you want it done, yesterday, but we've all been there. We've all wanted to be the author first instead of being the writer. And I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way. You have to do the writing. So you say you have a full manuscript, it's all finished, you formatted it, you need an agent. I can't find you an agent, but I can point you to the beautiful website of the Association of Authors Representatives. You say you've queried so on and on it goes. But look, everyone probably does have a book in them, and most of those books have some value. It's persistence that makes an author. And if you don't want to be persistent, if you want someone to do all of this for you, just forget about it. It's a long road. It isn't easy, and it isn't, the way to be rich. Like you said earlier, don't quit your day job. What it is fulfilling and satisfying, and you hope that you're going to reach other people. And that's why we do what we do, right, Michael?
Exactly, right. Very nicely put. Okay, Beth Ann, thanks so much for coming on and talk to me. Remind our listeners where they can find your podcast and your Twitter feed.
The podcast, first, you can find me at TheBookMaven, and I will point you to at Miss Pages Pod on Twitter. We are at Missing Pages Pod on Instagram, and missingpages.com everywhere else. And the podcast can be accessed anywhere you get your podcast. It's produced by the Podglomerate, which is an incredible team that I'm so proud to have worked with. And I hope that we'll get a lot more listeners for season 1. We're doing really well so far. Okay. So thanks for having me on, Michael. I've had a great conversation with you.
Well, we'll have to do it again after that trial so we know what the outcome is.
Yes, happy to come back.